What are you doing out here this late at night?
Taking photos for work. I'm an architectural consultant.
Why are you recording me right now?
For my safety, sir. I'm not interfering with your duties.
Hey, drop the phone. Stop resisting.
The yellow hue of the streetlights bled into the damp asphalt of Elm Street, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to swallow the edges of the neighborhood. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like a held breath. Marcus Vance stood on the corner, the collar of his dark jacket pulled up against the biting October chill. At 34, Marcus was a meticulous man, an architectural consultant whose livelihood depended on seeing what others missed. Tonight, he was examining the facade of a shuttered brick warehouse, a property his firm was considering for a major redevelopment project. He held his smartphone up, angling the camera to capture the way the ambient light hit the decaying masonry, tapping the screen to adjust the exposure. He was simply doing his job, existing in a public space, completely unaware that the next 10 minutes of his life would unravel into a nightmare that would ultimately cost the city $3.2 million. A block away, the low hum of a police cruiser's engine broke the silence. Officer Thomas Hayes was 3 hours into a double shift, fighting the slow, creeping exhaustion that settles behind the eyes of a veteran cop. Hayes considered himself a good officer, a proactive patrolman who didn't just wait for dispatch to ring but actively hunted for trouble before it materialized. But proactivity, when unmoored from objective facts, easily drifts into the dangerous territory of bias. As the cruiser rolled past the intersection, Hayes's eyes locked onto Marcus. In the dark, Hayes didn't see an architectural consultant evaluating a property. Filtered through a lifetime of unchecked assumptions and the cynical lens of his profession, Hayes saw a black man in dark clothing, loitering outside a closed business, holding a device in his hand. It was a textbook manifestation of a gut feeling, a visceral response masquerading as police intuition. The cruiser didn't use its sirens. It just slowed to a crawl, the tires hissing against the wet road until it angled toward the curb, bathing Marcus in the harsh, blinding glare of the vehicle's spotlights. Marcus lowered his phone, squinting against the sudden assault of light. A knot tightened in his stomach. It was a familiar generational anxiety, an involuntary physiological response to being suddenly, intensely scrutinized by law enforcement. The heavy door of this cruiser swung open, and Officer Hayes stepped out, resting his hand casually near his duty belt. He didn't unholster his weapon, but the posture was an unmistakable projection of authority. "Evening," Hayes called out, his voice carrying the practiced, flat affect of a man accustomed to compliance. "What brings you out here tonight?" Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing his voice to remain steady. He knew the unwritten rules of this encounter. "Just taking some photos of the building," Marcus replied, gesturing vaguely toward the warehouse. "I work in architecture. We're looking at this property." Hayes stepped closer, invading the invisible boundary of personal space just enough to establish dominance. "At midnight? Taking pictures of a closed business?" Hayes's tone was laced with heavy skepticism. To Hayes, the explanation sounded rehearsed, a convenient lie. He couldn't reconcile his preconceived notion of a late-night prowler with the reality of the man standing in front of him. "You got any ID on you?" This was the pivotal moment, the invisible line between a consensual encounter and a legal detention. Under the law, specifically the precedent surrounding the Fourth Amendment, a police officer can approach anyone in public and ask questions. The citizen is entirely free to ignore them and walk away. But to legally detain someone, to compel them to stay and identify themselves, an officer must have reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed. A hunch, a gut feeling, or the mere fact that a person is standing in a high-crime area does not meet this standard. Marcus, acutely aware of his rights but deeply fearful of the reality of the street, held his ground. "Officer, I'm just doing my job. Am I being detained, or am I free to go?" The question struck a nerve. Hayes stiffened. To an officer trained to command a scene, a citizen asserting their constitutional rights is rarely interpreted as civic awareness. It is almost universally perceived as defiance, evasiveness, or an admission of hidden guilt. "I'm conducting an investigation," Hayes countered, his voice dropping an octave, losing its initial veneer of casual inquiry. "There's been burglaries in this area. You're matching a description. Now hand over your ID." The claim of matching a description is a notorious catch-all, a tactical phrasing used to retroactively justify a stop. Marcus knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also recognized the rapidly escalating danger. The situation was slipping from a misunderstanding into a power struggle. Slowly, keeping his movements telegraphed and visible, Marcus raised his hands slightly. "Officer, I don't want any trouble, but I haven't committed a crime, and you don't have reasonable suspicion to detain me." With his left hand, Marcus deliberately raised his smartphone, tapping the screen to begin recording. The red light blinked in the darkness. "I am recording this interaction for my own safety," Marcus stated, his voice trembling just enough to betray his fear, but firm enough to hold his ground. The sight of the camera lens was a catalyst. The dynamic of the encounter shifted violently. In the modern era of policing, the smartphone camera is the great equalizer, a silent, objective witness that strips away the shield of unquestioned authority. The First Amendment undeniably protects the right of citizens to record police officers performing their duties in public spaces. But for Hayes, exhausted, frustrated, and deeply offended by the challenge to his authority, the camera was an intolerable provocation. His training evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and an ego-driven need to regain total control. "Put the phone down," Hayes demanded, stepping forward, closing the distance completely. "I have a right to record," Marcus replied, stepping back, trying to maintain distance. "I am not interfering with your duties." "I said put the damn phone down. It's an officer safety issue," Hayes barked. The phrase officer safety is the ultimate trump card in police procedure, often used to bypass constitutional constraints. But legally, a cell phone is not a weapon, and recording from a safe distance does not constitute a threat or physical interference. Before Marcus could take another step backward, Hayes lunged. The movement was sudden, violent, and utterly devoid of legal justification. Hayes's heavy hand clamped down on Marcus's wrist, twisting it sharply. With his other hand, Hayes snatched the smartphone from Marcus's grip. The phone clattered onto the hood of the cruiser, the screen cracking but the red recording light continuing to blink steadily. "Hey, you can't take that!" Marcus yelled, the pain in his wrist shooting up his arm. He pulled back instinctively, a natural human reflex to pain and unprovoked physical contact. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Hayes shouted, the volume of his voice designed not for Marcus but for his own body camera microphone, constructing a narrative of a violent encounter for the inevitable paperwork. He slammed Marcus against the side of the cruiser, the cold metal biting into Marcus's cheek. Handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting into the skin. In a matter of 3 minutes, an innocent man taking photographs had been physically assaulted, his property seized, and his freedom stripped away, all because a police officer allowed his bias to override the Constitution. This was the fatal procedural failure. Hayes had executed a warrantless seizure of Marcus's property, a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment, and arrested him without probable cause, the legal standard required to make an arrest. The entire cascade of events was poisoned fruit, born from an unlawful detention. The ride to the precinct was a silent, suffocating blur. Marcus sat in the back of the cruiser, his hands numb, his mind racing through a terrifying labyrinth of worst-case scenarios. The booking process was deliberately dehumanizing. The harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of stale sweat and industrial cleaner, the cold indifference of the desk sergeant. Marcus was charged with obstruction of justice and resisting arrest, the standard fallback charges when an officer has no underlying crime to point to. He spent 14 hours in a concrete cell, staring at a rusted toilet, the weight of the injustice pressing down on his chest like an anvil. He was eventually released on bail, stepping out into the blinding afternoon sun, clutching a plastic bag containing his cracked phone, his shoelaces, and his shattered sense of security. But Marcus did not let it fade into a bitter memory. The system relies on attrition. It relies on citizens being too exhausted, too intimidated, or too broke to fight back once the immediate terror of the arrest has passed. Marcus, however, found an attorney, a sharp, methodical civil rights lawyer named Sarah Jenkins, who made her career dissecting police reports and cross-referencing them against civil liberties. The criminal charges against Marcus were quietly dropped by the district attorney's office 6 weeks later. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a sterile piece of paper stating that the state was declining to prosecute in the interest of justice. But the dismissal was only the beginning. Sarah Jenkins filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Hayes and the city, alleging false arrest, excessive force, First Amendment retaliation, and malicious prosecution. The discovery phase of the civil suit is where the machinery of justice grinds the finest. This is where narratives are subjected to the brutal, unforgiving light of objective evidence. Hayes's body camera footage, along with the audio file miraculously recovered from Marcus's seized phone, painted a damning, incontrovertible picture. During his deposition, Officer Hayes sat in a sterile conference room, dressed in a sharp suit, looking remarkably smaller without his badge and uniform. Jenkins paced the floor, systematically dismantling his justifications. "Officer Hayes," Jenkins began, her voice calm but razor-sharp, "you stated in your report that Mr. Vance matched the description of a burglary suspect. What was that description?" Hayes cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Black male, dark clothing, nighttime hours." "I see," Jenkins replied, opening a file. "I have the dispatch logs for your precinct for the 48 hours preceding this incident. There were 2 reported commercial burglaries. The suspect in the first was described as a white male in his 20s with a visible neck tattoo. The suspect in the second was an unknown individual driving a silver sedan. Where precisely did you receive the description of a black male in dark clothing?" Hayes stared at the table. The silence in the room was deafening. "It was general intelligence regarding the area." "General intelligence," Jenkins repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "So a guess. A presumption based on his race and the hour of the night." Before Hayes could object, she pressed on. "Let's move to the seizure of the phone. You claimed officer safety. Was Mr. Vance wielding the phone in a threatening manner?" "He was moving it aggressively," Hayes deflected. Jenkins pushed a laptop toward him and hit play. The video showed Marcus's hand, steady, simply holding the device up. The video shows no aggressive movement. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. You had no warrant. You had no exigent circumstances. You had a man exercising his First Amendment right to record you. You snatched his property because you were angry, didn't you, Officer Hayes? The city's legal counsel didn't let Hayes answer. They didn't need to. The city attorney knew that putting Thomas Hayes on a witness stand in front of a federal jury would be a massacre. The combination of clear constitutional violations, undeniable video evidence, and a highly sympathetic plaintiff who had suffered genuine emotional and professional distress was a recipe for catastrophic punitive damages. Risk management actuaries for the city ran the numbers. They looked at the pattern of behavior. Hayes had 2 prior, albeit less documented, complaints regarding aggressive stops. They looked at the current political climate, where juries were increasingly intolerant of procedural abuse captured on camera. Taking this to trial wasn't just risking a loss, it was risking a verdict that could bankrupt the municipal insurance pool and spark public outrage. The settlement negotiations were tense, but brief. The city wanted to pay $500,000 and admit no fault. Jenkins demanded $5 million and a public apology. They settled, after weeks of grinding mediation, for $3.2 million. The money was transferred into a trust account on a rainy Tuesday morning, nearly 18 months after the incident on Elm Street. Marcus Vance was suddenly a wealthy man, but the money felt heavy, tainted by the trauma of how it was acquired. He bought a new house, expanded his consulting firm, and donated a substantial portion to legal defense funds for marginalized communities. But the money didn't erase the flinch he felt whenever a police siren wailed in the distance. It didn't stop him from constantly checking his rearview mirror or from the cold sweat that broke out on the back of his neck when he saw a squad car parked on the street. The consequences for the other side were quiet, bureaucratic, and distinctly lacking in cinematic justice. Officer Thomas Hayes did not go to prison. He was not paraded in handcuffs. The city, as part of the settlement, admitted no legal liability. Hayes was placed on administrative leave during the internal affairs investigation. Shortly after the check to Marcus cleared, Hayes quietly submitted his resignation, keeping his pension intact, and took a job providing private security for a logistics company in a neighboring county. It was a sterile transactional resolution. The city simply bought its way out of an egregious constitutional violation with taxpayer money. Yet the ripple effects were profound. The massive payout triggered an audit of the police department's training protocols. The chief of police instituted mandatory, rigorous refreshers on Fourth Amendment constraints and the legal rights of citizens to record police interactions. New policies strictly mandated that body cameras could never be muted during an encounter. The financial pain inflicted on the city forced a structural change that moral arguments had previously failed to achieve. We are often told that the law is a shield, an objective set of rules designed to protect the innocent from the overreach of the powerful. But the reality is that the law is only as strong as the human beings tasked with enforcing it. When bias is allowed to masquerade as intuition, when procedural safeguards are ignored in the name of authority, the shield becomes a weapon. A simple interaction on a quiet street corner shouldn't hinge on whether a citizen knows case law better than the officer detaining them. Marcus Vance survived his encounter. He had the fortitude, the resources, and the irrefutable digital evidence to fight back and win. But for every Marcus, how many others have had their phones taken, their voices silenced, and their rights trampled in the dark, with no camera recording and no $3 million settlement waiting at the end? When those sworn to uphold the Constitution view its protections as mere obstacles to their authority, who is truly keeping the peace?